Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Nuñez. I'm a PhD student at the University of Arizona, and my presentation for the conference is entitled A Catcher's Mask, Vincent Nava, Baseball's Color Line, and Mexican-American Racialization. For a lot of Latinx peoples, like Mexicans, they occupy a tenuous or intermediate status between not just black and white poles, but also the poles of inclusion and exclusion. And at times, this could grant the ability to circumnavigate color lines and barriers in order to participate in what were traditionally white spaces. And although they were legally considered white, Mexican Americans nonetheless encountered frequent and dejecting instances of discrimination on the basis of race. This racial ambiguity that they possessed, though, did provide opportunities to construct or to negotiate their own racial identities in a way that could propel them closer to the full rights and benefits of participation in white society. So this fluidity of being Mexican is what allowed Vincent Nava, the first Mexican American to play professional baseball in the United States, to participate at the highest echelons of the sport way back in the 1880s. Now, Vincent Nava, along with his team called the Providence Grays, they engaged in a construction of a whitened racial identity that justified his inclusion in the sport. The fluidity of Mexican-American racial identity that Nava and other Mexicans possessed also meant that they were pursuing whiteness. So beyond just legal forms of citizenship, even local practices and customs espoused segregation practices that limited property rights, mobility, and economic opportunities for many Mexican Americans. Now, Nava's mother is actually a migrant. She migrated from Durango, Mexico, to San Francisco in the mid-1800s. She did marry a migrant, remarry in 1865. This man was named William Irwin. He was from England. And when they got married, they actually moved away from the Latin quarter of the city. And when Nava grew up, he actually was listed in city directories and the census records as a dependent of William Irwin. So he appeared as Vincent Irwin rather than the Latin surname Nava. Now, the neighborhood where Nava grew up in South San Francisco was right next to a brand new ball field pictured here called the Recreation Grounds. And this opened in 1868 when Vincent was 8 years old. Baseball had made its way into San Francisco by 1860. Some players started to stand out, and Vincent Nava was one of them, except he was popularly known in the press as either Vincent Irwin or his nickname Sandy Irwin, kind of hiding the fact that he legally had an ethnically Mexican surname. Now, the advantage that Nava had, of course, was playing under the name of Vincent or Sandy Irwin, which allowed him to minimize any possible situations where he may experience racial discrimination or exclusion. Now, he played for the San Francisco Rhinos at this ballpark right here and earned praise from the press as, quote, one of the best belonging to any club in the league. And he was such a standout that he actually gained the attention of professionals who played back east, where the top teams were located. Even as early as when he was 18 years old, local newspapers were identifying Nava as an emerging bright spot in the sport. And the teams like the Rhinos that he played on really valued his skills as a catcher. This was before modern protective equipment. So you had to be tough and disciplined, and he had those characteristics. And so what this did for him was in 1882, he actually had some further opportunities that were opened up to him. There was a governing body for the sport of baseball called the National Association of Baseball Players. And in the 1860s, one of these applicants that they saw was a team called the Philadelphia Pythians, who were an all-black team. But what the Pythians did was they forced the association to consider a question they had not already done so, at least formally, and that was how to address the participation of Black players. Now, when, of course, they unanimously voted to reject their application for membership, citing to bar, quote, any club composed of one or more colored persons. And what this did was it officially set the game of baseball as reflecting the attitudes of racial segregation that were very prominent in many parts of the country. What they did was they kind of cloaked that in sort of this disguise of meritocracy. So they would justify the color line in the sport on the grounds that players of color lacked the necessary character, skills, leadership, and other traits that were necessary to uphold the virtues of the sport. So it was a sort of like a character clause that they projected onto players of color and assumed that they would not be able to hold those virtues up. Here are some sort of caricatures of how popular media and other sort of white spectators portrayed players of color as being uncouth, unorganized, undisciplined, and not deserving of membership in professional leagues and organizations. Now, each of these traits that baseball endowed upon itself represented what they defined as, white male middle class ideals, and institutions of power like the sport of baseball used these traits to justify the exclusion of non-white populations from white spaces. So opponents of racial integration, even outside of baseball, would cite these character clauses to protest the idea of including Black players and arguing that their lack of temperament, skill, and intelligence disqualified them from being able to participate. So in order to overcome this color line and to participate in this sport, non-white players had two options. You could either advocate for racial equality, which would more than likely fall upon deaf ears, or you could find ways to obtain those elements of whiteness that had justified their exclusion in the first place. And so Nava, when he played as Vincent Irwin or Sandy Irwin in San Francisco, he was already doing this. He was already pursuing characteristics of whiteness that is as superficial as having an anglicized name. So at the end of the 1881 season in San Francisco, when Providence teammates were noticing him and recruiting him to join the Grays, what the Grays did in their communications with management was they said that they had found, quote, a catcher in San Francisco who handles delivery in fine form. We want to bring him east. He is a Spaniard. Now, they did not label Vincent Nava as a Spaniard out of error. How Providence players and management, when they were discussing signing him to a contract, they addressed any possible concerns or objections to the thought of signing him because of his darker complexion, but ultimately agreed that his skills as a catcher were very valuable. And they sort of, as a consolation, said that he could, quote, serve as a strong advertising card for the club. So upon beginning his new career in Providence, Nava actually underwent another name change. So he went from Vincent or Sandy Irwin back to Vincent Nava as his playing name. And what this did was constructing a new identity for himself with an ethnically Spanish background. And so having that Spaniard background as a substitution became a lot more palatable for the team and the rest of the organization. Spaniards in both the United States and in Mexico had typically been characterized as white. And ethnic Mexicans recognized that being able to claim Spanish ancestry often protected them from the full brunt of racial discrimination because there was a sense of security within what that white identity could provide for them. So this fluidity of Mexican Americans' ability to claim whiteness through a Spanish identity allowed them to engage in a form of racial passing. And as a result of this, Mexicans were able to sort of, at times, get around any possible instances of discrimination in employment, not being able to access segregated spaces, and sort of overcoming what had been a negative reputation towards Mexicans as lacking the necessary physical, intellectual, and cultural capabilities to obtain citizenship. These stereotypes were also very present in the baseball world as well. And these all sort of stemmed from the popular belief that Mexicans engaged in undisciplined and degenerate lifestyles. And so the transformation of Vincent Nava, the Spaniard, it propelled him towards a more acceptable white identity. This construction as a Spaniard showcases active collaboration between Nava and the Providence Grays to not only know about, but also capitalize upon popular racial perceptions, which simultaneously pushed Nava towards whiteness and distanced himself away from non-whiteness. Now, once the first season in Providence began, the press and fans both latched onto his identity as a Spaniard player. Providence actually increased their attendance that season. A lot of fans reported how they were very, quote, curious to see the Spaniard. And Nava did play a pretty key reserve role for the Providence Grays. And the Grays also saw an increase in profit. This was very rare, especially in early baseball, when many young franchises folded due to a lack of funds. And Providence, in Nava's third season with them, they actually ended up winning the 1884 championship against the New York Metropolitans of the American Association, in what many scholars and fans alike regard as sort of the first unofficial World Series. Now, despite Vincent Nava's positive contributions to the Grays, he did experience a series of injuries, some negative press accounts, especially in visiting cities, and ultimately failed to live up to the very high expectations that were set upon him. And all of this gradually eroded his positive reception. The lack of participation due to injury forced the team to consider alternatives at that position. And that often disappointed fans who specifically wanted to see Vincent Nava, the Spaniard, play baseball. So after 3 seasons in Providence and at the ripe young age of 24 years old, the team decided to not re-sign him for another contract. Vincent Nava spent the final 2 years of his professional career with the team in Baltimore, and just year after year, his playing time diminished, as did his performance. So in addition to his subpar performance as a player, he also fell victim to what anthropologist Howard Winnett refers to as racial lumping. Now, this is suggested that fans and press failed to discern ethnic and racial differences between various minority populations. At any point in the press, Vincent Nava was at one instance referred to as either Cuban, mulatto, African, Arabian, Italian, Portuguese, and then the pejorative term Dago. All of these appeared in at least one press account referring to Vincent Nava. So as a result, perceptions of Nava, even though Nava and the Grays very clearly attempted to construct this Spanish identity for him, these perceptions of Nava still skirted around those constructions of identity. So another instance of sort of racialization that he went through was the use of the press in phonetic dialogue. So they would often mock Vincent Nava's perceived accent. It's not even clear if he had an accent, but even still, the newspapers still took the time to quote him in phonetic dialogue in broken English, as you can see with this example here. So his projected white identity was very similar to the story of many other Mexican Americans who attempted to do the same. in that at many times those constructions ultimately failed to deflect discriminatory commentary, racialization, or just treatment in general. The combination of injury-ridden absences from the games, the dissipation of his attraction for fans, and contributions in targeting Nava as an ethnic anomaly gradually eroded his ability to align with the game's ideal images of whiteness and white participation in an honorable game. Now, Nava remained in Baltimore after the end of his professional career, even though he did bounce around in other semi-professional and military leagues for a few years afterwards, but he ceased playing baseball by about 1890. He passed away in 1906 due to complications from uremia. He did work at a local bar, and he, in 1906, his death probably represents the ultimate paradox. All his life in government records, he had been listed as legally white. And even when he passed away in 1906, death certificate stating he was legally white, Vincent Nava was still buried in a segregated cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland. So it's sort of the ultimate, insult to him as someone who spent much of his life pursuing elements of whiteness that his final resting place was still in a non-white space. The construction of whiteness that Mexican Americans attempted to create, not just Navas, but thousands of other Mexicans across the United States. What it does is it also demonstrates that race is performative. Ariella Gross sums it up pretty well when she writes that race was not only something people were, it was something they did. You projected a racial identity through your behaviors, through your cultural expressions, through your other actions that reflect what elements of society you want privilege to. So there is a performative aspect to that racial identity as well. The pursuit of whiteness for Mexican Americans, however, was a double-edged sword. So even though it did serve as a form of resistance for people like Nava, what this strategy ultimately does in pursuing whiteness is that it simultaneously buttresses and reinforces the ideas that white institutions try to enforce in the first place. So when Nava and Providence Grays claimed his identity as a Spaniard, what that did was they were complicit in enforcing the color line by trying to justify and validate whiteness as the reason for his acceptance onto the team. By pursuing whiteness and the characteristics associated with it, individuals consequently validated the standards and expectations of white supremacy and substantiated that racial difference should be measurable and acknowledged in the allowance of certain rights, privileges, and access. So although Nava did not topple or breach the color barrier, he was, at least for a time, successful in circumnavigating it. Nava's case study provides a tangible example to analyze the complexity of American racial understandings and how those understandings shifted and adapted to new situations over time. Mexican Americans could stake a tenuous claim to whiteness, and although successful at times, the presence of misinformed perceptions, stereotypes, and the shifting definitions of racial exclusion and exclusion made this claim to whiteness at best weak and conditional. For Nava, the pursuit of access to a white space, the baseball diamond, turned the sport into a laboratory of the race-making process. Here's a final photo of Nava's roster with the Providence Grays in 1884. He is seated on the bottom row, cross-legged to the very left. And this is my contact information. Thank you all very much for virtually attending my presentation. I hope it was an illuminating experience for you. If you have any questions or would like to contact me at all, this is my student email address. Feel free to send me a note. But thank you once again for including me as part of the conference program. And I look forward to interacting with you all very shortly. Thank you.